Okay, so So if I've just popped up here, it was because I selected the wrong live stream. And so I was live streaming to something different. So I apologize for that for those of you who actually were connected to the correct live stream. So sorry for the delay. And just for sort of appearing here a little bit late. But we were, in class here, we were just reading over these questions again that we talked about yesterday. And I'll say good morning to people. So Erin is here, good morning to you. Basil's here, good morning. Michelle is here, good morning to you, Michelle. Blake is here, good morning, Blake. Anna Dawn, good morning to you, sir. Again, sorry for being late. I just clicked the wrong live stream and I went live to the wrong place. Sometimes that happens. Technology, right? Okie dokie. Let's talk about these questions. So the first question I asked you from yesterday was the kind of cultural developments that happened around 3600 to 3300 BCE in Egypt. So around 56 to 5300 years ago. What was going on? Lots? Tell me about this lots you refer to. Actually, that reminds me when often when students write papers, they say, there are so many ways in which this happens, and then they can name like one. so don't say there are so many ways that something happens if you can only think of one thing, okay? So again, don't say lots if you don't know what the lots are. But anyway, what are some of the things that are happening?
Their culture was based on religion.
Okay, so we have a group of people living in Egypt and around the Nile River, and they're an intensely religious people, or at least they become that over time. That is very true.
Very expert in trading. They have the Nile.
Right, so there's kind of trade happening up and down the Nile from a very early period, right? There's lots of little towns and settlements along the Nile, and so people are moving up and down, trading back and forth. Right? They invent a writing system, which is pretty nifty. What else? What's that? Right? So they're farming communities, right? Probably from around 10,000 years ago or so, but toward this period, what starts to happen?
Drying.
Yeah, we get into a period, again, climate change. The Earth's climate is always fluctuating slightly, and so we get into a period where things are getting a little warmer and a little drier.
What was the term for that?
For the climate change? Oh, they used, I think, did they use desertification or desiccation? Desiccation, yeah. So desiccation is the process of something becoming dry. They actually use the term when they make mummies as well, because the body needs to be dried before it can be mummified. And so the body is, there's a process of desiccation that happens where desiccation where the body is dried out. But yeah, so Egypt is dried out here. There's less farmland available. And so people are kind of forced to move and farm closer to the river. And they have to be, again, more careful about how they farm, right? They start practicing more intensive agriculture. They start growing more food, and complexity, social and political complexity kind of evolve from that, right? Right, so pharaohs are, and again, this doesn't happen immediately, but pharaohs are eventually, the kings of Egypt are eventually referred to or thought of as gods on earth, right? Not kings, but literal gods. What's interesting in this part is they kind of describe the process of how these kings developed. Do you remember what they said about it? How people came to power? Because I said that happened, right? Remember when I had that chart and it had all those blocks, the blue and red blocks? And I told you that, intensive agriculture needed an administration for the canals and it evolved into a state. How do they describe that here? How are some people able to gain power?
Access to resources.
They're able to gain access to resources later. There's something else.
God gave it to them.
God gave them what?
The power. Oh,
Yep.
this is my commandments. You be my.
Right? Yeah, so they try to legitimize their power by convincing people that the God chose them. But how do we know that the God chose them? Because what?
Is planet of Narnia?
Okay, we'll get to Narmer in a second.
They have like so many resources. Here I'm guessing.
Okay.
I'm honest. I'm guessing.
Tell me what I want to hear. Tell me what how do these kind of people who become leaders and kings, how do they convince people that the gods have favored them? Yes. What?
By setting rules.
No. If the gods favor you, it's easier to set rules.
They have specifications. They give them.
It has to do with the flooding of the Nile.
Huh?
It has to do with the flooding of the Nile. Did they what? Yeah, they predicted it. So every year the Nile floods, right? And so the river rises, it covers the farmlands in water, and then when the floods recede, when the waters go back down, it leaves this nice thick layer of organic silt and soil that makes the farmland really productive. But it's important to predict when this is going to happen and how much of a flood there's going to be. And so if you can predict this, if you can predict when the floods will come and how high the flood will be, well, you must be favored by the gods, right? The gods must have told you, and you would say this, of course, the gods have told me that the waters shall rise on this day. And if it actually happens, then people are like, oh man, the God told that dude when it was going to happen, and it happened. And so some people can convince other people that, I have divine knowledge. The gods have favored and spoken to me, and now I can tell you. And so they're able to kind of gain power and respect and prestige, right? And over time, this kind of evolves into a situation where not only are these leaders favored by the gods, but they actually are the gods, right? They are a god on earth, right? And again, it takes time for these beliefs to kind of evolve and develop, but it has to do with being able to predict the floods and tell what's going to happen. And, it's a bit of a guess, but if you're right, it looks like you knew, right? It looks like the gods told you when this was going to happen. And so, earlier on, there is some kind of science and practice to it, but I'm not sure how they did it. But it was very important to be able to forecast when the Nile would rise and by how much. Okay, and so the flooding of the Nile was kind of a yearly thing, and it kind of came at the same time. But the better you were at predicting it, the happier everyone was, and the more it showed that the gods favored you. Okay, so yeah, they were making a bit of a guess, but again, if you're right, looks good, right? Looks like you knew all along. It's just like if you invest in stocks, you could just throw darts at a dartboard and pick your stocks, but if you make a lot of money, it'll look like you knew all along, right? So the roles of the pharaohs in Egypt are what? What is the role of Pharaoh? To collect money? Yeah, that's true, right? People will owe taxes to the royal house. They will owe taxes to the pharaoh. Sometimes they'll pay in goods, or They'll pay in farm produce and harvest. Sometimes they'll pay with their actual labor. So your taxes might be that 2 months a year you work for Pharaoh and you do whatever he wants, right? Maybe like build a pyramid, right? Money isn't really a thing quite early on, and so people will often pay taxes with the thing they produce, so grain or something else, but often it'll be through their labor. And so 2 months a year, you work for Pharaoh and you're working on a dam or a canal or a temple or a pyramid or some such thing. That's how people pay their taxes.
Setting rules.
What's that?
They also set rules.
Right, the Pharaoh tells the people what to do and sets laws and rules. What's that?
Punishment, which is mostly death.
Punishment, which is probably mostly death. Yeah, it's true. The Pharaoh is kind of the judge, the grand judge of the state. What else does Pharaoh do?
They eat, they drink, they sleep.
Yes, they do, as do all of us. What else does Pharaoh do? What is he responsible for? I say he because it's almost always a he, although there have been a few female pharaohs, but what else is he responsible for? Ruling ancient Egypt. How about rituals? Rituals? Pharaoh has a lot of rituals to perform, right? He has a lot of gods to pray to, sacrifices to make, offerings to give. And in theory, if he does all these correctly, then the gods will favor Egypt, right? And people will look at him as a great pharaoh, right? If he's not fulfilling his obligations to the gods, things will go downhill, right? There'll be, locusts, or the harvest won't come in properly, or the Nile won't flood the way people expect it to. And then people will say, oh, Pharaoh must be doing a bad job, right? So it's Pharaoh's job to do all these rituals and continually please the gods, right, in order to ensure that that Egypt is prosperous, right? And so again, if you're lucky and things go well, people will think of you as a great pharaoh, and if you're unlucky and things don't go well, you'll be thought of poorly.
So you are always referring to they want the acceptance and the pleasing of gods. So did they believe in more than one god?
Yes, as we'll talk about that very shortly. Just like the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians are polytheistic, except for a very short period where one pharaoh tried to create a monotheistic religion. Didn't get any traction, and they went back to polytheism. But yeah, they're polytheistic. They've got lots of different gods, and we'll meet some of them very shortly. Right. So what do we know about this Narmer character, or Menez?
He's like the story, the same story as the prophet Moses.
No. Is it?
Yeah, when he thrown in the
I thought that was Sargon of Akkad. Does Narmer have a basket in the river story too? Really? Maybe. I don't remember that coming up in the text. But what else do we know about him from the text? Yes, he unified Egypt into a single state. And so Egypt was kind of existing in a two-kingdom state, right? There was a lower Egypt, which is kind of the north half, and then an upper Egypt, which is the southern half. They each kind of had a king, but Narmer comes along with his club, subdues both kingdoms, and creates a unified Egypt. And for most of Egypt's ancient history, it will be a single unified state, which is different from Mesopotamia, right? Because Mesopotamia was a bunch of cities that were always fighting with each other until the Akkadians came in and created an empire, right? But the Egyptians kind of unite and pretty much remain a single entity for all of their ancient history. How is he similar to Hammurabi? Remember Hammurabi's?
he claimed
right? He claims his connection to the gods, right? And to legitimize his rule, right? What else did he do? One more thing. Artifacts? They both have artifacts, and what do those artifacts do? What's the function? Not so much for Narmer, definitely for Hammurabi. But what else does it do? Yeah, it shows that relation to the gods, and it tells the story, right? It tells the story that, yes, Narmer is now the king of Egypt, and if you look at this palette, you'll see why, right? Because he kicked butt, right? He went around with his club, and he subdued his enemies, and he is now the king, right? It proclaims his control of the area, just like Hammurabi's did, right? Hammurabi took over most of Mesopotamia in a Babylonian empire, and the Code of Hammurabi says that yes, these are the laws, but it also says that, and he's in charge, by the way. He's in charge because the gods have given him this power, right? So again, it proclaims to everyone that this is the leader, and here's why. Egyptians had their own writing style. How is this different from the cuneiform writing that we saw in Mesopotamia? What's that? Okay, what kind of characteristics are different?
The shape of the letters, right?
Definitely.
It's made up of two parts. The sound part and the
Right. So if we're talking about hieroglyphic language, which is probably, when we think of ancient Egyptian writing, we think of hieroglyphic. I've got some pictures for you in just a minute. There's actually two kinds of symbols, right? Sometimes those symbols are phonograms, phono being sound. So they're characters or they're symbols that represent a sound, like or p or or whatever, right? They create a sound. Some of those symbols are actually pictograms or ideograms, and so they represent a whole word or a whole concept, right? That's different from cuneiform, right? Cuneiform was entirely phonetic, right? It was all about symbols for different sounds, just like English is, right? English is all symbols that create different sounds, and so that was the same for cuneiform, but the Egyptians have a different script where sometimes you have sounds, sometimes you have entire words that a symbol represents. Anything else different about hieroglyphic? Or not hieroglyphic, but Egyptian writing systems?
they have multiple writing systems.
Yeah.
I thought they use this for also like the Sumerian, where they wrote dances and bells.
That's probably a similarity. So the Egyptians probably used their writing system to record similar types of information as the Mesopotamians did, right? So probably lots of tax records and court documents and official decisions, but also religious hymns and prayers, stories, all kinds of things, right? So they probably wrote down a lot of the same kinds of things. But as Mulder mentioned, yeah, there's also three types of Egyptian writing, right? Cuneiform, there's only one, but the Egyptians had three different ways of writing their language, which I'll show you in a second. We'll come back to that innovations thing. Let me show you some pictures here, if I can. Okay. I'll show you pictures in a minute. Okay. So we talked about that, the cultural developments. We talked about pharaohs and what we talked about Narmer. Oh yeah. So here's this stone palette, is what they call it, the Narmer palette. And this is where we see Narmer legitimizing his rule, right? So on the left here, you can see him, and he's got his enemies by the hair, and he's got his club, and what do you think he's going to do? Bop him on the head, right? Lights out. So, and look, he's standing on a bunch of his slain enemies, right? Look at all those people he has overcome, he has beaten, and now he's going to bop this guy too, right? So he's a big, powerful leader, and he has, through military conquest, he has united Egypt, right? Look at the top of that one on the left-hand side too. You can see the goddess Hathor. Hathor is the god of, what is she the god of? I think she's the goddess of agriculture and farming, but she's also, sometimes she appears as a cow. And so Egyptian gods, as we'll get to in a minute, sometimes Egyptian gods are in human form, sometimes they're shown as a human body with an animal head, which you've probably seen, and sometimes they're shown as just an entire animal. And so Hathor can be shown as a human, or a cow-headed human, or as just a whole cow. It's not saying that she is a cow, that's a different thing. But so there's Hathor at the top, kind of looking down on Narmer and saying, good work, pal. I approve of you, right? So we're getting the approval of the gods here. And so again, they point out, if you look at the other side of this palette on the right side, you can see kind of a victory parade happening at the top where Narmer is kind of being proclaimed as the victor, right? And then at the bottom, I'm not sure what's going on. There's some strange creatures with intertwined necks. I don't know what's happening down there. But again, Hathor is kind of looking down, approving of Narmer, right? Blessing his conquest. I don't know if you saw that, or I don't know if they showed this in the textbook, but I'll show it to you now. You'll see this in other inscriptions and paintings in ancient Egypt as well. The two crowns of ancient Egypt, right? So the white crown is the crown for Upper Egypt, for the southern part, and the red part is the crown for Lower Egypt, the northern part. And so often you'll see pharaohs wearing both at the same time, and so showing that they are in fact the leader of a united Egypt, right, of Upper and Lower Egypt. Yes? The lower is the northern part because it is in reference to the flow of the river. So
Which one's the lower?
The lower one is in the north. Oh, here it's the red one. So the one with the little frog tongue grabbing a fly. I don't know what it is. It's kind of a strange looking crown. But yeah, so we see most pharaohs wearing the double crown, right? Showing that they're king of a united Egypt. Right, the writing system. So there's three types that they mentioned. Actually, they only mentioned two, I think, in the textbook, but there's three. There's hieroglyphic and hieratic and demotic. And so again, hieroglyphic is the one that we are probably most familiar with when you think of ancient Egypt. You probably think of this sort of very pictorial script with lots of, birds and humans and owls and what else is in here? Boats, all kinds of snakes, all kinds of interesting little symbols, right? And that's kind of what we imagine it. And I think it's the first one that's developed in ancient Egypt is this type of writing. The ancient Egyptians kind of developed this one first, but they develop other ones because, as you can imagine, this probably takes a long time to write down, right? If you were like trying to take notes in class in hieroglyphic, not possible, right? You're never going to be able to keep up. You need a quicker way to jot down ideas. So this is, I think, the first script that they developed, but eventually it just becomes like the formal version. So if you see things on tomb walls or on temples, they write in the sort of formal style. But if you're just, writing a shopping list to go to the market, you're not going to write in this. It takes too long, right? But again, it's a pretty interesting script to look at, right? The other interesting thing about it is, again, it's a complicated way of writing because it has kind of three different types of symbols. And I know the text only mentioned two, but there's actually three. So, did it mention three? Oh, good, awesome. One of them is phonetics. So again, the symbol represents the sound, or or whatever. Sometimes the symbol represents an idea or a thing, right? And so again, if you're a Mandarin speaker or Mandarin reader, Mandarin works this way. There's a character means an entire concept or word. And then you have symbols that indicate how you should be reading it, right? So if you come across an owl when you're reading hieroglyphic, the question is, are they talking about an owl, or is it the sound that the owl makes? Not like hoot hoot, but the sound like or something. And sometimes it's confusing, and so they have little symbols that tell you whether you should be thinking about the sound or thinking about the concept, right? So it's kind of a what's that?
What's the third one?
Determinative. So they determine whether it's a phonogram or an ideogram or pictogram that you should be reading it as. A little bit tricky. I think Arabic's like this too. Arabic doesn't write its vowels, but correct me if I'm wrong. Arabic doesn't write its vowels, but sometimes you need an indication of what the vowel is if it could go either way, right? But most of the time what's that?
Well, also this,
Yeah?
to make o, e.
Right. Oh, the three. Yeah. But I'm saying like the vowels don't get written unless there's a word where like it could be two things that might make sense, and so then they tell you, right? I don't know. I thought I learned this. I only took Arabic 100 in university, but I thought that was the case, is that vowels weren't written unless it was a case where two vowels might work and it might be confusing. And then you kind of tell people which one you mean. But normally you just don't write the vowels and people just know what they are. Is that right?
So, I'm not fully understanding. What do you mean like vowels? The letters?
No, like the A's, E's, and I's, and Oo's, and sounds like that. Those aren't usually written, right?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like by saying it,
Yeah. Yeah, you know what they are. Yeah. But when you're learning them, they write them all in because you don't know, right? Or I didn't know. Okay, anyway, I found this online. You can actually type your name in ancient Egyptian and it will spit it out. So that's my name, apparently. Is it accurate? I have no idea. But it was kind of fun to do, so I did it. And if you're interested, you can try it too. And again, it's all phonetic, right? So it approximates the sounds of my name. But again, would an ancient Egyptian read this and say my name correctly? I don't know. It was interesting. So hieroglyphics is one form of Egyptian writing. The second one was hieratic. And so this is usually written on paper, and it's usually written by scribes. And so again, it helps them keep up, right? So if you're trying to take notes on what Pharaoh says in an audience of Pharaoh, and you're trying to write it down to get a record, hieroglyphics take too long. You need a faster system. And so hieratic looks something like this. And so you can almost see a little bit how it might be a very simplified form of hieroglyphics, right? If you kind of blur your eyes, it almost looks somewhat similar, right? So you can see how they might have adapted this quick form just to kind of keep track of things and write things quickly, right? And the last version was demotic. And demotic is kind of created last, I think. And again, it's a quicker form of writing things down. And so you can see some similarities from the hieroglyphic and the hieratic. It almost looks a little bit, it almost looks reminiscent of Arabic characters, but I'm not sure if there's a connection between the demotic script and the Arabic one. Maybe there is or maybe there isn't. I really don't know. But some of the swoopiness of it looks, yeah, it almost looks, oh, okay. Yeah, and I don't know. Yeah, I don't think there's a connection because I know the Egyptians in this period aren't Arabs, right? The Arabs show up in Egypt kind of in the 600 AD kind of time period. So this is before any sort of, I think, Arabic influence in Egypt. But I don't know. I don't know if there's a connection between the two or not. And I don't know when the Arabs start writing things down either. So long time ago, yeah. So maybe they just happen to look a little similar, but they're not really. They're not connected. Anyway, there's 3 types, and this one is kind of important because this Demotic script and hieroglyphic script are the first to be translated. And so for a long time, nobody was able to read hieroglyphics. We don't really know this yet, but eventually Egypt will be conquered by the Greeks, and then the Romans, and then other groups, and eventually people will stop speaking ancient Egyptian, and the language will be lost, and the ability to read ancient Egyptian will be lost as well. So for really hundreds and hundreds of years, nobody knows how to read any of this stuff until the discovery of this hunk of rock right here. And this is the somewhat famous Rosetta Stone. And so it's found at a place called Rosetta in Egypt. And of course, that's the, if you want to learn a language, that's the software you can buy, right? You can buy Rosetta Stone, and that name for the language software comes from this. And this is notable again because it's got the same thing written 3 times, okay? And so at the top, it's got something written in hieroglyphic, ancient Egyptian, and then in the middle, it's got the same thing written in Demotic, which sucked because nobody knew how to read either of those things. But then the bottom part is written in ancient Greek. And we know how to read ancient Greek. Ancient Greek was never forgotten, right? It was spoken and written all the way up until recent times. And so because we were able to read the bottom section, scholars were able to start comparing and saying, oh, okay, here's this word, and we think this word is here, right? And maybe this sound is here, and they started piecing it together. Apparently it took 25 years to translate this thing. But once they figured it out, it was the key to reading everything else. And then we were able to read inscriptions on temples, paintings on tomb walls, papyrus, all kinds of things suddenly opened up this world for us into ancient Egypt. And suddenly we can know what these people were talking about and what they believed and what they felt and liked and didn't like and what their dreams were and all kinds of things that are, suddenly available to us simply because of being able to do this. So again, writing is important for a society and a culture, but it's also super important for the people who want to study it, right? Because people can tell us exactly what they think and feel and believe, and there's no other way to know that, right? Especially when the culture is long gone. So this is a huge archaeological find, right? This was the ticket into ancient Egypt and ancient Egyptian writing. Yeah, so again, it's found in 1799, a couple hundred years ago. And again, it's not, do I say that? Yeah, it's basically the same thing written 3 times, and that's what allows people to translate out. But again, it's not an easy process. It takes like decades to figure it out, but people do. Oh yeah, and one of the ways that one of the first clues to kind of figuring out how this works was these little things here. So early on, before people could read hieroglyphics, there was kind of a working theory that, you see these little kind of bubbles, the little bubbles? The little bubbles are called a cartouche. They're cartouches. And the little cartouche, people thought that they were the names of the king. So the name of the king is written inside these little bubbles, okay? And so that was kind of the working theory, and that turned out to be true. And so that was kind of one of the things that they started to match, right? In Greek, they read the name of the king, or the pharaoh, whoever the pharaoh was, and then they would see the cartouche, and they're like, oh, okay, we think that's the name of the king right there. And so that was one of the first things that they were able to connect between the scripts, and were able to kind of work backwards from there. But anyway, whenever you see in hieroglyphics these little bubbles, that's the name of a king written, the name of Pharaoh. I guess this is another question I asked you, but here are some ancient Egyptian innovations. So again, just like the Mesopotamians, they developed intensive agriculture. They had a bunch of dams and canals and dikes and irrigation ditches to bring water from the river out into the fields and water their crops. Super important, because Egypt is a desert. You need to water your crops, right? They developed one of the earliest writing systems, right? So very shortly after Mesopotamia starts developing theirs, the Egyptians start creating their hieroglyphic writing system too. They create paper, right? Papyrus is a kind of a reed that grows beside the Nile, like those things that grow in water, those big long things. Papyrus is a reed, and so the ancient Egyptians ground it all up and pressed it into paper, and so they had paper to write on. They created ramps and levers to help them build. They too created a 12-month calendar with 365 days. Nailed it, right? Thousands of years ago, got it right. They developed glass making. So the Egyptians had glass, just like we do. Arithmetic and geometry and mathematics. They figured this out too. You cannot build a perfectly square level pyramid unless you know the math and can do the math. And they did. There's all kinds of medical procedures and cures for things that the Egyptians developed. And again, those things are written down. So we know, if you had a stomach ache or if you had an infection, we know what the Egyptians would have prescribed to take care of those things, because they had doctors too. Of course, I would rather go to a modern hospital than an ancient Egyptian doctor, but a few thousand years ago, doctors are good, right? And again, lots of stone carving techniques. And so unlike the Mesopotamians, who built most of their stuff in mud brick or clay brick, the Egyptians were working in stone, right? And all kinds of limestone, which is a little bit softer, but all the way to like granite and basalt, which are super hard rocks. They're really difficult to work. And yet the Egyptians figure out a way to do it, and do it beautifully. Yeah, man, they're super cool. Okay, let's take a little break, and we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about religion and those polytheistic gods that we were referring to earlier. So take a break and then come back. Okay, and we are back. So we've talked a little bit about ancient Egyptian, kind of the very beginnings and the sort of base level of their culture, sort of an intensive agricultural civilization living next to the Nile River. Again, like Mesopotamia, populations are rising and their social and political and economic and religious lives are becoming kind of more complex, right? They have a writing system which allowed them to keep track of all kinds of different things, and of course gives us a much clearer window into the world of what they were experiencing and thinking and feeling and all kinds of things. So that kind of brings us to religion. One of the things that we said about the Egyptians was that they were profoundly religious, right? And again, if your leader is a god, if your king is actually an honest to God God, if your leader is a god, then basically everything you do is religious. Paying taxes is religious, right? Because you're paying them to the house of a god, right? So religion is kind of, flowing through every aspect of ancient Egyptians' lives. And again, that's different from a lot of modern countries where we attempt to separate the church and the state, right? And so here in Canada, the Canadian government, religion really has no meaningful part in it, right? It's supposed to be entirely secular. Whether it is all the time is another question, but it's supposed to be separate. But here in ancient Egypt, there's no division, right? Religion and political control are one and the same, right? And one of the things that we can kind of talk about with the Egyptians, because they were so religious, is actually what religion is and what is it actually for. And so before we kind of talk about this, maybe I'll just say that the intent here is to look at religion from an anthropological point of view. And an anthropologist would look at religion and say, basically, that religion is a thing that humans create. Okay? It's a social institution, or it's a set of stories, or a set of morals. All these things are kind of tied together, but anthropologists would look at a culture's religion and say, we're not trying to figure out whether God is real or whether these people are right. We're looking at religion in terms of this system that they've created, what it means and how it works. And so this is kind of how we'll be talking about it here. And so if you belong to a certain faith or religion and have beliefs, I'm not trying to challenge those beliefs in any way or tell you that you're wrong. We're just looking at religion through the eyes of anthropology and science. Okay? So please don't be upset or offended. I mean no disrespect. We're just looking at things from the perspective of science. Okay? So here's a religious text from ancient Egypt. And it's from something that's kind of very ominously titled the Book of the Dead. Ooh. Sometimes in movies, the Book of the Dead is a very spooky, mystical, magical thing. In actual ancient Egyptian life, it was not. It was very readily available. You could buy a copy anywhere and read it for yourself. It wasn't a spooky, magical book. But what it was an important kind of list of information you would need if you were going to die. And so the idea here is that when you die in ancient Egypt, you descend into the underworld and you will be judged whether or not you can enter paradise. Okay, and so to kind of make it through the underworld, you need kind of a guidebook, if you will. You need a bit of a map in terms of what you should be careful of, where you should go. Some beings and things are going to ask you questions, and you're going to need to know the right answers. And so the Book of the Dead tells you all of those things. It tells you how to navigate your way through the underworld. It tells you the right prayers and answers to questions and all kinds of things. And so here's a scene here from the judgment of a dead person. And what's happening is that the person's heart is being judged, okay? And so here you can see in two places, actually. It's the same character. The god with the head of the jackal, that's Anubis. And Anubis starts out as kind of the god of mummification. Later, he becomes kind of the god of the underworld as well. But Anubis is going to weigh the heart of the dead person. And so you can see there's a scale here, right? Like a balance scale. And so on one side, on the left side, the person's heart is in that little cup. And on the right side is the feather of truth, sometimes called mat, the feather of truth. And so they're going to weigh the person's heart and see if they are able to enter paradise. And here, you can't really see because my head's in the way, but if I move my head over, you can see the god Tot. And Tot is the god of scribes and the god of writing. And so Tot is there to record the verdict, right? Will the person's heart pass the test, and will this person enter paradise or not? So if the weighing comes out correct, you may enter paradise. If it doesn't, your heart will be fed to the crocodile monster, which is sitting there ready to devour the heart, right? So again, a little window into part of the ancient Egyptian religion anyway. This is what we'll define religion as for the purposes of this course, okay? We'll say that religion is a few things. It is beliefs and rituals that cultures use to help maintain the social order. And I think, Mulder, that was something that you said a few days ago, right? That religion can be a means of social control. And indeed it is, right? Every religious tradition has morals or rules or ways that you should act if you want to be a good person. Do this, don't do that, right? All religions have some form of kind of moral center that gives people rules about how to behave, right? Even if they're very basic. Religion is also a system that we should think about too, that evolves within culture, but it exists to meet the needs of people, right? And one of those needs might be the need for social control, to have people, you know, cooperating and feeling safe living next door to each other, right? If my religion says thou shalt not kill, it's nice to know that my neighbor also feels that thou shalt not kill. So if my music is up a little bit loud one night, he's not going to murder me, right? So it's comforting for people to have these shared beliefs and kind of shared ideas of what's right and wrong, right? It's also a very symbolic practice that maintains the worldview of a culture. So every culture has an idea about what the world is and how it works, right? What is the nature of the universe? Who is in control of this universe? Is it a single god? Is it multiple gods? Is it the force? What is it, right? How does the world operate? Does it operate by a system of natural laws? Does it operate according to the will of the god, or of multiple gods, or of the force? Use the force. No. And the other thing it does is it engages people in a collective experience, okay? And I'll talk about those in a second. So, some characteristics of religion. There are 5. All religions assume that that supernatural beings or supernatural powers exist, okay? And within that religion, there are people who are trained or who are gifted and know how to interact with that supernatural force, right? So again, if you belong to a monotheistic religion like Judaism or Christianity or Islam, there is God, right? The one God, Yahweh or God or Jehovah or Allah or whatever name you want to use or not want to use. There is a God, and there are priests or imams that help people to communicate with the God, or they know how to communicate with God as well. All religions have this, right? People who are knowledgeable and can interact with the world of the supernatural, right? Priests or religious leaders or Jedi Knights, if you're into Star Wars, people who know how to interact with this supernatural force, okay, or understand the nature of it. All religions rationalize, so they kind of make them seem true, they rationalize their religious systems through the use of myths and storytelling. Okay? And that storytelling, those myths are consistent with the sort of values and beliefs of that society. And so we heard a story about, we heard a similar story, or a story that fits into this category, with the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Gilgamesh was a story. It was a fun story about this king of Uruk who went on all these adventures, but also it legitimized the religious view of the society because it had certain gods showing up in the story, right? Ishtar shows up. Gilgamesh's mother shows up, and I can't remember what her name is now. Nintura, I think. Nintura shows up. These gods kind of show up in order to show you that the religion is true, right? These gods are real. You can think of the story of Jesus as one of these as well. And again, if you're a believer in Christianity, you won't think of it this way. But if you're an anthropologist, you'll look and you'll say, yeah, the story of Jesus legitimizes all the other beliefs that Christians have, right? The idea that, God exists because this is his son, right? And this is what happened to his son. And this is why those things happened, right? So the story of Jesus legitimizes God and his power and all of the other stories that are around that God, right? That he created the heavens and the earth and all of these other things. Does anyone know who these characters are? Huh? The who? But, oh yeah, but do you know where they come from? I think they're from Philippines actually, and so they're kind of mythical characters in the Philippines. And so again, there's all kinds of different characters. Maybe they're Gilgamesh, maybe they're Jesus, maybe they're Muhammad, maybe they're some of these characters, maybe they're some of the characters we'll meet from ancient Egypt: Osiris and Set and Horus and Isis. Not that Isis, different Isis. Characteristic number 3, all religions serve to reduce anxiety by providing an explanation for the unknown and for teaching moral orders. So what happens when we die? Well, nobody really knows for sure, but religions provide an answer to that, right? All religions have some sort of explanation saying what happens when you die. Why are we here? What is the purpose of our lives, right? Why are things the way they are, right? Religion provides these kinds of answers for us. Nowadays, many of us rely on science to explain a lot of these things, right? Like what happens when it rains and, why is it light sometimes and dark other times? We know those things because of science, right? But there's also religious explanations for those things that people relied on when they weren't so scientific. And again, some of those questions cannot be answered by science, right? What happens when we die? Science doesn't really know, right? It can tell us what happens to our bodies, but what happens to our spirit or soul or Ka for the ancient Egyptians? What's that? Yeah, you have to assume you have a soul in the first place. And science doesn't really have a way to describe or measure that, right? Even consciousness is a bit of an issue, or not an issue, but a bit of a puzzle scientifically. We still don't know what it is, right? This experience that I'm having right now, we don't really know how to describe that. Do you know who you are? Do you know who you are? Yeah, you all know who you are, but if you look at your brain, there is no part of your brain where the self resides, right? We often like to think that, inside our brains is a little mini version of ourselves kind of, controlling us, right? And pressing buttons and, navigating us through life. But there's no part of the brain that corresponds with that idea. There's no part of the brain where you are. And so what is it to be you? Right? Where is that self centered? Where does that self live? We're not really sure. And so, even though science can answer things like the rain and the sun, science cannot answer, so far, questions of what is consciousness? What does it mean to have an idea that you are who you are, your concept of self? What is that, and where does it come from, and where does it live? We don't really know that either. But religion helps explain those things to us. 4, religion is a convenient way of transferring the burden of decision-making from individuals to supernatural powers. And so it's much easier to take orders from a god than it is to take orders from a human. And so we've already seen a few leaders like Hammurabi and Narmer, where they legitimized their power and strength by connecting themselves to the gods, right? So you can gain power by convincing people that the gods favor you, or the gods bless you, or the gods told you some secret information, or maybe that you actually are a god, right? That helps give you power and authority. But also, it gives you a little bit of gives you plausible deniability. It gives you a little bit of, if you make a decision and it all goes wrong, people don't, you can say, don't blame me. The gods told us to do this. I don't know why it all went wrong. Maybe we didn't make the right offerings, right? So you can kind of, instead of being punished for your bad decisions, you can push it off to the god, right? And people don't punish the gods, they punish kings. And so it's easier if you can make the gods responsible for decisions, not yourself, right? And the last one is that religion serves as a mechanism, we talked about this, of social control by establishing appropriate behaviors and punishing those who don't follow the rules, right? And again, religions have can have very strong punishments, right? If you murder somebody, you may go to hell, right? That is the kind of Christian conception of laws and punishment, right? And you would think that would be a very strong deterrent, right? I don't want to break that rule because I don't want to end up spending the rest of eternity in a fiery pit of torture, right? That's a really strong, that's a strong punishment. It's a strong deterrent, right? So religions can have a lot of power over people and can really encourage social control because they can suggest punishments or rewards that are just difficult to duplicate here on earth, right? You would imagine there's no punishment on earth that is as bad as being cast into a pit of fire for all eternity, right? That sounds absolutely horrible, and it's difficult to imagine a worse punishment here on earth, right? So religions can offer rewards and punishments that are far in excess of what we can offer here on earth, right? Be a good person and you will enter paradise and live in bliss for eternity. It's a hell of a motivation, right? That's a really good motivation for doing good things. And so, yeah, religions can do this as well. They can motivate people to follow the rules because their rewards and punishments can be so extreme. They can be so strong, right? Better than anything we could offer on earth. So we got those 5 characteristics. So Egyptian spirituality, like we said, is polytheistic. There's lots of different gods. Poly means many. And they control various aspects of human life, but also of the natural environment. Most of the gods we see are going to be anthropomorphic. Anthro being man and morphic being shape, right? So they're in the shape or in the form of human beings. Lots of Disney movies are anthropomorphic too because there's usually lots of animals running around that are like humans. Zootopia, anyone seen Zootopia? No? Great movie. Yeah? Yeah. Zootopia, all the animals are anthropomorphic. They're walking around and talking and doing things that humans do, but they're animals, right? Same thing happens here. Oh, interesting. Kind of the main god of Egypt is a god called Ra. And Ra is kind of not, he in a way, he's kind of like seen as the head of the gods or one of the most important ones. And this probably makes sense because if you're in Egypt, the sun is a major part of your life, right? The sun is always there. It rarely ever rains. It's not cloudy. The sun is always present, right? Shining on your face, burning your skin, growing your crops. It's always there. And so Ra becomes a very important god in Egypt because the sun is such an important part of the experience of living in Egypt. The other thing I'll call your attention to here is the idea of a pantheon. And pantheons are kind of a family of gods, a collection of gods that, you know, a society imagines to exist. Okay? So, that said, do I want to do this now? Where's my, okay. I just want to introduce you to a few gods because I've got a video that talks about this pantheon of Egyptian gods and talks a little bit about kind of a prominent story in ancient Egyptian religion, one that's kind of important for their understanding of the world, okay? In a similar way to Gilgamesh. So this is one of the gods that we will need to know, and his name is Osiris, okay? And Osiris, you can see here, he is represented as a king, right? So here we see him wearing the crown of Upper Egypt. He's got these kind of feathers on there, which I don't know what the significance of those is, but he's depicted as a king, okay? And you can tell he's a king because he has the beard, right? That's a symbol of kingship right there, that long braided beard. And he has two other symbols of kingship too. He's got the crook, that little hook thing, and he's got the flail, which is like a whip. And so those two things are kind of symbols of kingship. And so whenever you see someone holding those two things, the crook and the flail with the beard, those are symbols of Pharaoh, symbols of the king. He is a very important god in ancient Egypt. Lots of people made offerings to him and worshipped him. And he, at one point, is the king of the underworld as well. And so he's always portrayed as being this kind of greenish color, right? And the reason he's greenish is because as a god of the underworld, he stands for fertility, right? And that's kind of the color of that, you know, that mud that floods over the land and replenishes the fields. That's kind of the color of that mud. And so Osiris is kind of, you know, all death, but also rebirth. And so he's shown as this kind of green character, but a king, right? A king of the underworld. We'll hear a little bit more about him in the video story. We should also know about Isis here, and not Isis like the Islamic State Isis, but Isis, the ancient Egyptian goddess. And so she's the wife of Osiris, but also the sister of Osiris. And Mulder popped up his head like, say what? Yeah. It's true. There's an incestuous relationship happening here in ancient Egyptian religion. So Osiris and Isis are brother and sister, but they're also husband and wife. And so you can see her here. She's often shown as a human being, but often she has these kind of bird wings attached to her as well. She's worshipped throughout Egypt. Again, she's kind of a bit of a mother figure, kind of a protector figure. If you're familiar with Christianity, in a way she's kind of like Mary, the mother of Jesus. She has that kind of feeling about her, right? She's kind of a maternal mother, protector, role model kind of figure, right? Isis is kind of like that. And interestingly, she continued to be worshipped even after kind of ancient Egyptian was over, or ancient Egypt was kind of over. And so some Greeks and Romans continued to worship Isis after ancient Egypt and kind of outside of Egypt as well. So
They're probably like synchronized
Yeah. Yeah, and in some cases, we haven't really talked about that, but yeah, in some cases that happens where, some people who are, when you have a religion that's polytheistic, it's much easier for people to worship different gods because it's already okay to worship different gods, right? If you're in a monotheistic religion like Christianity, kind of the first thing God says is, "Thou shalt not have other gods before me," right? Which means I'm the only God, all those other gods don't exist, right? They're made up. So, but if you belong to a polytheistic religion, it's much easier to worship other gods. And so sometimes these gods, you might be a Roman, but you worship Isis, right? Or you might see Isis as similar to one of your gods, or we might have kind of overlap between Isis and the Virgin Mary, or sometimes these traditions get kind of mingled together as time goes on. Tomorrow we'll meet Horus. Horus is a very important god in ancient Egypt. He is the son of Osiris and Isis, and he is an important figure. He's usually shown as either a falcon or a man with the head of a falcon. And so here's Horus here. He's kind of the protector of the pharaoh. He's identified with the pharaoh, so Horus is a god who looks down on the pharaoh and protects him. But the pharaoh is also kind of assumed to be Horus in a way as well, so there's kind of a weird overlap there. He's kind of a hero. Horus becomes kind of a hero to young men, particularly in ancient Egypt. And so I'm trying to think of a comparison. But he's a heroic warrior. He's the good guy. He's a handsome, dashing young man, and so he's the god that a lot of young men kind of look up to. So he's kind of a role model in that way too. But he's important. And finally, this dude here, Set. And Set is kind of a strange character. It's not entirely clear what kind of animal he's supposed to be. He kind of looks a little bit like a jackal or an aardvark. Sometimes he's shown as a black pig or sometimes as a hippo. He's kind of a weird collection of odd creatures, okay? Early on, he's kind of he's the god of the desert. He's the god of the wind. He's the god of chaos. So when things are a little out of control, Set is responsible. But over time, as the story of Osiris and Isis and Ra or Horus, as that story evolves, he kind of becomes a little bit of the bad guy. And so he kind of transitions into the evil god, right? The bad god. But you can also think of him as a bit of a trickster as well. And maybe we can talk a little bit about tricksters tomorrow. But many religions or religious traditions have a trickster figure as well. So a character who's kind of has godlike powers, but they don't always act honorably, right? They're tricky, they like to manipulate people, they like to cause trouble for other people. A perfect example of a trickster figure is Loki from Marvel Universe. And so Loki is pulled from the Norse tradition, right? Like Odin and Thor. But Loki is a trickster figure, right? You never know what he's going to do. You never know whose side he's on. Sometimes he'll help you. Sometimes he'll betray you. Sometimes he'll do both things at the same time. Sometimes he'll get himself into trouble. You never know, right? You never know what Loki's going to do. And so lots of religious traditions have trickster figures like this. In indigenous North American indigenous groups, often it's Coyote or the Raven, which are tricksters. And Set is kind of a trickster as well, right? He's kind of an agent of chaos, and you never really know what he's going to do. Right, and so that brings us to this little video on ancient Egyptian pantheons. And so I'll show it to you, but I think I'll show it to you tomorrow because I don't want to run out of time on this. But when we watch, I'll ask you these questions, okay? I'll ask you, what's the purpose of the gods and why do people imagine these divine characters? Mike Rugnetta will have some answers there. He'll point out something significant about the Sumerian pantheon. So he'll be talking about Sumerian gods, but also Egyptian gods. And then I have some questions about Egyptian gods. Who's the first one? How do we know that the sun was important to ancient Egyptian religion? And we'll learn the story of Osiris and Isis and Set and Horus. And that'll be important because it's a big story. Okay? It's a big story in sort of ancient Egyptian religion. But I'll probably leave it there because we don't have enough time to deal with that all in one shot, and I don't want you to forget the video tomorrow when we talk about it. So I'll press pause there. Tomorrow we'll come back and we'll learn about these ancient Egyptian pantheons and stories and see what we can learn about the ancient Egyptians from that. Okay? So, that is it. Have a nice afternoon. Try to get some sun if you can, or some Ra, if you will. And I'll see you tomorrow.